the house next to the cemetery, a deadly haunting. This story revolves around a young woman named Sarah who visits her fiancé's family for the first time. What begins as a simple trip home soon takes a dark turn as they pass a dragon fruit orchard and a cemetery filled with strange occurrences. Sarah, who has unresolved feelings for a long-lost lover, starts seeing terrifying visions of his face in the orchard. These visions disturb her as the couple navigates the eerie roads leading to her fiancé's rural home, right next to a cemetery. Sarah's disturbing past begins to collide with her present when she starts feeling an inexplicable connection to the deceased. Her nightmares become real when her old lover, presumed dead, reaches out from beyond the grave. Sarah, haunted by the supernatural and plagued by her unresolved emotions, must now confront the past and her inner demons. Is it all in her head, or is something far more sinister at play? Part 1. The Uneasy Journey. Sarah sat silently in the car, the rhythmic hum of the tires on the country road doing little to calm her nerves. The sun was beginning to set, casting long, eerie shadows across the winding road ahead. Next to her, Ethan was smiling, his face illuminated by the warm glow of the evening sun. He looked at ease, completely unaware of the growing tension in Sarah's chest. The fields stretched endlessly on either side of them, golden and serene. There was nothing particularly ominous about the scenery, yet Sarah couldn't shake the unease that had settled over her like a heavy fog. She glanced over at Ethan, who was humming along to the radio, one hand lazily draped over the steering wheel. How could he be so relaxed? How could he not feel the oppressive weight that seemed to hang in the air? She didn't want to ruin the mood. This was supposed to be a happy trip, her first visit to meet his family, to finally see where Ethan had grown up. But there was something about this place, this journey, that made her stomach churn. "It's going to be fine," Ethan said suddenly, breaking the silence as if he could sense her discomfort. Sarah forced a smile, nodding slightly. "Yeah, I know, but the truth was she didn't know. She didn't know if anything was going to be fine." There was a part of this journey she hadn't told Ethan about. This wasn't just any village they were driving to. This was Jason's village. Jason. The name echoed in her mind like a bell tolling in the distance. Her first love. The boy she had once thought she'd marry. The boy who had disappeared without a trace, leaving her heart shattered. And now, years later, she was driving back to the place where it had all started, the place where Jason had vanished. Sarah's hand unconsciously tightened into a fist in her lap as they approached the old iron bridge. Her throat felt tight, and a cold sweat began to form on the back of her neck. She had forgotten about the bridge. Of course they'd have to cross it to reach Ethan's village. That bridge was the last place she had ever seen Jason. It loomed ahead, a skeletal structure of rusted iron, arching over a narrow, fast-moving river. The sound of the water below was barely audible through the closed windows, but Sarah could feel the bridge's presence as if it were breathing. She could almost hear the groan of the metal under the car's weight as they rolled onto it, the tires clanging against the uneven surface. The bridge swayed slightly with the wind, its railings covered in vines and moss, like something forgotten by time. Her heart raced and she tried to keep her breathing steady, but the memories flooded back, vivid and relentless. She and Jason had stood on this very bridge that night. It had been raining, a soft drizzle that misted the air and made the world seem ethereal. Jason had been acting strange, distant, as if there was something weighing on his mind. She had asked him what was wrong, but he had just smiled that half smile of his, the one that didn't reach his eyes. And then, just like that, he had disappeared, vanished into the night without a trace. No note, no phone call, nothing. One day he was there, and the next he was gone. It was as if he had never existed. The local police had searched for him, of course. There had been rumors, whispers of accidents, of dark secrets buried deep within the village, but nothing had ever been confirmed. And eventually, the search had been called off, and Jason had become just another missing person, his memory fading like mist in the morning sun. But not for Sarah. She had never forgotten him. And now, here she was crossing the same bridge returning to the same village where he had disappeared. "You okay?" Ethan's voice snapped her back to the present. She realized her breathing had become shallow, her hands gripping the seat so tightly that her knuckles were white. She forced herself to relax, to exhale slowly. "Yeah, I'm fine," she lied, offering him another weak smile. Ethan glanced at her for a moment, concern flickering in his eyes, but then he turned his attention back to the road. They were almost across the bridge now, the village just beyond the bend. As they reached the end of the bridge, Sarah's eyes caught something, a flash of movement in the trees to the left. It was so quick, so subtle, that she almost dismissed it as a trick of the light. But there it was again, just out of the corner of her eye. She turned her head sharply, trying to get a better look, but the trees were still. Nothing moved, just shadows. Her pulse quickened, and she felt a chill run down her spine. It was probably nothing, she told herself. Probably just an animal. But deep down, she wasn't sure. As they continued down the road, the cemetery came into view, its crumbling stone walls lining the edge of the village. The headstones were ancient, some of them leaning precariously, half covered in ivy and moss. The sight of it made Sarah's stomach turn. She had always hated cemeteries, but there was something particularly unsettling about this one. Ethan slowed the car as they passed by, and Sarah couldn't help but stare. The cemetery stretched on for what seemed like miles, the headstones like jagged teeth rising from the earth. The trees here were different, their branches gnarled and twisted, like the fingers of some monstrous creature. The setting sun cast long shadows across the graves, giving the entire place a surreal, almost nightmarish quality. For a brief moment, Sarah thought she saw a figure standing among the graves, a tall, dark figure, watching them as they passed. But when she blinked, it was gone. Her heart skipped a beat, and she quickly turned her gaze back to the road, not daring to look again. "You're really quiet," Ethan said softly, his hand brushing against hers. Nervous about meeting my family, Sarah swallowed, forcing herself to focus on the present. "Yeah, I guess so, but it wasn't Ethan's family she was afraid of." They drove on in silence, the car's engine the only sound in the heavy air. The village came into view, nestled in the valley like a forgotten relic. The houses were old, their roofs sagging under the weight of years. The streets were empty, not a single person in sight. It was as if the village had been abandoned long ago, left to rot in the shadow of the cemetery. Ethan parked the car in front of a small, modest house at the edge of the village. He smiled at Sarah, his eyes full of excitement. "We're here," but Sarah could barely bring herself to move. Her eyes were fixed on the cemetery, her mind racing with thoughts of Jason, of the bridge, of the figure she had seen among the graves. Ethan stepped out of the car and walked around to her side, opening the door for her. "Come on, you'll love it here." "My family is great," Sarah nodded mechanically, forcing herself to step out of the car. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and decay, and the shadows seemed to grow longer as the sun dipped below the horizon. Ethan took her hand, leading her toward the house, but Sarah's eyes remained on the cemetery, her heart pounding in her chest. Somewhere, deep in the pit of her stomach, she knew this wasn't just a trip to meet Ethan's family. This was something much darker, something she had left unfinished. And as they walked toward the house, she couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was watching her from the shadows. The uneasy journey had only just begun. Part 2. The Haunting Memory. The road ahead stretched out endlessly, winding through the quiet countryside. The golden light of the setting sun filtered through the trees, casting long, ghostly shadows across the narrow path. Sarah sat quietly beside Ethan, her heart still racing from their unsettling drive across the iron bridge. Her mind was miles away, tangled in a web of forgotten memories and unresolved emotions. She was trying to keep her thoughts grounded, to focus on the present and on Ethan, the man she was now engaged to. But no matter how hard she tried, her mind kept wandering back to Jason. The sound of his laughter, the touch of his hand on hers, the way he would smile at her as though she was the only person in the world, and then like a sharp knife slicing through the memory, the image of him disappearing, vanishing from her life without a trace. The unanswered questions gnawed at her even after all these years. Where had he gone? Why hadn't he told her anything? And why now, when she was supposed to be starting a new chapter of her life, was his memory haunting her so vividly? The car bumped over a small pothole, jolting Sarah from her thoughts. She blinked, shaking her head slightly as though trying to dislodge her memories. She glanced out the window, watching the trees blur past. The landscape was changing, the fields giving way to rows of strange, otherworldly plants that seemed to stretch endlessly into the horizon. It took her a moment to realize what she was looking at: a dragon fruit orchard. The sight of the gnarled, twisted branches covered in the vibrant red fruit was oddly unsettling. The plants, with their sharp, spiked arms reaching out like skeletal fingers, seemed almost alive, as though they were watching her. The sun, now dipping lower in the sky, cast an eerie glow over the orchard, making the shadows between the plants seem darker, deeper. Sarah felt her pulse quicken. There was something off about this place, something that made her skin crawl. She wasn't sure why, but she had the sudden, inexplicable urge to look deeper into the orchard, to peer into the dark spaces between the trees. She turned her head, squinting as she tried to make out the shapes hidden in the shadows. And then she saw it, him. Her breath caught in her throat, and for a moment she couldn't move, couldn't blink. Standing there, just beyond the edge of the trees, was Jason. His face, pale and gaunt, stared back at her from the shadows, his hollow eyes locked onto hers with an intensity that made her blood run cold. His lips curled into a smile, a twisted, eerie smile that sent a shiver down her spine. It wasn't the smile she remembered. It was something else, something darker, something that didn't belong to him. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest, her pulse roaring in her ears. She blinked hard, hoping the image would disappear, that it was just her mind playing tricks on her. But when she opened her eyes again, he was still there watching her. His figure seemed to flicker in and out of the shadows, like a broken image, as though he wasn't fully there, not fully part of this world anymore. Sarah Eaton's voice was soft, concerned. "You okay?" She couldn't tear her eyes away from Jason's face. She felt like she was trapped in some sort of nightmarish trance, unable to look away, unable to move. The longer she stared, the more the world around her seemed to blur, as though everything but him was fading into nothingness. Jason's eyes bored into hers, and in that moment she felt something dark, something cold reach deep into her chest, wrapping itself around her heart. It was as though he was pulling her toward him, drawing her back into the past, into a place she had fought so hard to leave behind. Suddenly the air felt heavy, thick with the scent of earth and decay. The temperature seemed to drop, and Sarah shivered despite the warmth of the evening. Her hands trembled in her lap, her skin prickling with goosebumps. She wanted to scream, to yell for Ethan to stop the car, to turn around, to get her away from this place. But her voice was caught in her throat, strangled by fear. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, Jason's face vanished. Sarah blinked, her heart still pounding, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She stared out the window wide-eyed, searching the orchard for any sign of him, but there was nothing. No movement, no shadowy figure. Just the twisted branches of the dragon fruit plant swaying gently in the breeze. "What's wrong?" Ethan asked again, his voice tinged with worry as he glanced over at her. I thought I saw," Sarah stammered, her voice barely a whisper. She didn't even know how to finish the sentence. What had she seen? A ghost? A hallucination? Jason's face, staring back at her from the darkness? How could she explain that without sounding crazy? "Are you sure you're okay?" Ethan pressed, reaching over to rest his hand on hers. Sarah nodded quickly, trying to steady her breathing. "Yeah, I'm fine. Just tired, I guess," but she wasn't fine. Her mind was racing, her thoughts spinning wildly out of control. Had she really seen Jason? Was it just her imagination? Or was it something more, something real, something terrifying? The rest of the drive passed in a blur, Sarah's mind too preoccupied to focus on anything else. She kept glancing out the window, her eyes darting back to the orchard as it disappeared in the distance. But the more she thought about it, the more she began to doubt herself. Maybe it had just been a trick of the light, a product of her own exhaustion and anxiety. After all, Jason had been gone for years. There was no way it could have been him. But the memory of his face lingered in her mind, sharp and vivid. That smile, the way his lips had twisted into something grotesque, something unnatural. It was wrong. It wasn't the Jason she remembered, the boy she had loved so deeply. It was something else, something far more sinister. As they neared Ethan's village, Sarah felt a growing sense of dread settle over her like a heavy weight. The familiar landscape, the rolling hills and quiet roads, only served to amplify her unease. She had been here before with Jason in what felt like a lifetime ago. And now she was back, but everything felt different, darker, more dangerous. They passed the old, crumbling cemetery on the outskirts of the village, the headstones casting long shadows in the fading light. Sarah couldn't stop herself from looking, her eyes scanning the rows of graves, half expecting to see Jason's face among the tombstones. But the cemetery was empty, silent, its secrets buried deep beneath the earth. She tore her gaze away, her heart still pounding, and forced herself to focus on the present. This was Ethan's village. She was here with him, to meet his family, to start a new chapter of her life. Jason was gone. He had to be gone. But as they pulled up in front of Ethan's house, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone. That somewhere, out there in the shadows, Jason was watching. Inside the house, Ethan's family welcomed them with open arms. His mother, a small, kind-faced woman with silver hair, embraced Sarah warmly, her eyes filled with joy at finally meeting the woman her son was going to marry. His father, a quiet man with a weathered face, gave her a firm handshake, his smile reserved but genuine. Even Ethan's younger sister, a bubbly girl in her early 20s, greeted Sarah with a hug and excited chatter about the upcoming wedding. It should have been comforting. It should have put Sarah at ease. But as they sat down to dinner, her mind kept wandering back to the orchard, back to Jason's face, back to the hollow, haunted eyes that had stared at her from the shadows. She could still feel the chill of his gaze on her skin, could still hear the silence that had hung heavy in the air when he had vanished. She barely touched her food, her appetite long gone. She tried to smile to join in the conversation, but every time she opened her mouth to speak, the words seemed to catch in her throat. Ethan noticed, of course, and every now and then he would give her a concerned glance, his brow furrowing in worry. After dinner, Sarah excused herself to the bathroom, needing a moment to collect herself. She splashed cold water on her face, staring at her reflection in the mirror. She looked pale, almost sickly, her eyes wide and glassy. She took a deep breath, trying to steady her nerves, but the memory of Jason's face refused to leave her mind. What had she seen? Was it really him, or was it just her mind playing tricks on her, dredging up old memories that she had buried long ago? She turned off the faucet and dried her hands, glancing around the small bathroom. The house was quiet now, the sound of Ethan and his family's voices muffled in the distance. For a moment, Sarah allowed herself to relax. It was just her imagination. That's all it was. She had been tired, anxious, and her mind had conjured up a vision of Jason, because she was back in the village where everything had started. It was understandable. Nothing to be afraid of. But just as she was about to open the bathroom door, she froze. The mirror in front of her fogged over, as though someone had breathed on it. And there, in the condensation, a single word appeared, slowly, as if being written by an invisible hand. Come. Sarah's breath hitched in her throat, her heart pounding wildly. She backed away from the mirror, her legs trembling beneath her. Her mind screamed at her to leave, to run, to get as far away from this place as possible, but she couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The air in the bathroom grew colder, the temperature dropping rapidly, until she could see a breath in the air. The lights flickered, casting eerie shadows on the walls, and for a moment, the entire room seemed to shift, as though reality itself was bending. And then, in the reflection of the mirror, Jason appeared. His face, twisted and hollow, stared back at her from the foggy glass, his eyes filled with something dark, something that wasn't human. His smile was wide, too wide, his lips curling up unnaturally as he mouthed a single word, "Come." Sarah screamed. The haunting memory was no longer just a memory. It had come for her. Part 3. Arrival at the house. The car slowed as it turned down the gravel driveway, crunching over the stones, the sound echoing unnervingly in the stillness. As the vehicle approached Ethan's family home, the house came into view, a quaint, two-story structure with a well-worn charm. It was nestled snugly among tall trees, the landscape around it dotted with small gardens and patches of wild grass. To anyone else it might have seemed like a picture-perfect countryside retreat, but to Sarah it felt as though the house was shrouded in something far more sinister. The weight of the nearby cemetery pressed against her, unseen but palpable. She shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her eyes scanning the surroundings. Her heart pounded against her ribs as they passed the last stretch of road, flanked by the dark outlines of the headstones that loomed far too close for comfort. The old cemetery stretched for what seemed like miles, its ancient, crooked tombstones almost reaching the backyard of Ethan's home. The house stood at the very edge of that eerie place, as though it had been built with its back turned to the world of the living. "We're here," Ethan said, his voice warm, clearly excited to finally introduce Sarah to his family. He flashed her a smile as he brought the car to a halt. "You're going to love them," he added, unaware of the cold sweat forming on the back of Sarah's neck. Sarah forced a smile, but the unease that had been gnawing at her throughout the drive only deepened. Her hands felt clammy as she gripped the door handle and stepped out of the car. The air outside was heavy, the faint scent of earth and decay drifting in from the cemetery. A chill passed over her skin despite the late summer warmth. Ethan's family was already waiting on the porch. His mother, a small woman with kind eyes, waved enthusiastically as they approached. His father, tall and broad-shouldered, offered a stiff nod, but with a hint of a smile, his weathered face softened by the joy of seeing his son. Even Ethan's younger sister stood beside them, her face lighting up with curiosity at the sight of Sarah. There was warmth in their welcome, genuine and eager. But Sarah's gaze kept darting toward the cemetery, just visible through the trees. She couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone, that the shadows between the headstones were watching her, waiting. The wind rustled through the trees, carrying with it the soft sound of leaves brushing against the gravestones. For a moment, it almost sounded like a whisper, a faint, beckoning call. "Sarah, this is my mom," Alice, Ethan said, pulling her attention back to the present. His hand was on her arm, gently guiding her forward. Alice stepped forward with a wide smile, her arms outstretched for a hug. "It's so wonderful to finally meet you, Sarah," she exclaimed, wrapping Sarah in a brief but warm embrace. "Ethan's told us so much about you," Sarah smiled, her lips stiff. "It's great to meet you too, Mrs. Hall. Oh, please call me Alice," he insisted, waving off the formality. "We're family now." But even as Alice spoke with such warmth, Sarah's thoughts were miles away, her mind a whirl of dread and unease. Her eyes drifted again toward the cemetery, the dark outline of the gravestones just barely visible beyond the tree line. She could swear she saw movement, just a flicker, a shifting shadow among the stones. Jason thought his name whispered through her mind like a curse, lingering in the air around her, refusing to let go. "Sarah?" She jolted at the sound of Ethan's voice, realizing too late that Alice had been speaking to her. Both Ethan and his mother were looking at her expectantly, concern flickering in Ethan's eyes. "I am sorry, what was that?" She stammered, her voice slightly hoarse. "I was just saying we should get inside," Alice said, with a small laugh. "You must be exhausted from the drive." "Yeah, of course," Sarah mumbled, trying to pull herself together. She was here to meet Ethan's family, not to get lost in memories of a past that she had long since buried or tried to. But her mind refused to cooperate, stubbornly dragging her thoughts back to Jason's face, the way it had appeared in the orchard, those hollow, dead eyes staring at her as though from another world. She followed Ethan and his family into the house, her heart still racing. The interior was cozy, a stark contrast to the ominous feeling that had settled over Sarah. The living room was filled with family photos, warm, inviting furniture, and the faint scent of freshly baked bread lingering in the air. It should have felt like a refuge, a place of comfort. But Sarah's eyes couldn't help but drift toward the windows, the cemetery always just out of view, but never far from her mind. Dinner was a quiet, intimate affair. Alice had prepared a hearty meal: roast chicken, mashed potatoes, and a variety of vegetables, but Sarah could barely eat. The warm, golden light from the chandelier above the dining table should have been comforting, but it cast strange, shifting shadows on the walls, and Sarah couldn't stop herself from imagining Jason's figure lurking in those dark corners, watching her with that twisted smile. Ethan's father, John, asked her about her family, about her work, and Sarah did her best to answer politely, to stay engaged. But every time she lifted her fork, every time she tried to focus on the conversation, her mind would pull her back to the cemetery. She could almost feel its presence, creeping in through the walls, filling the room with a heavy, suffocating silence that only she seemed to notice. Alice was talking now, her voice bright and cheerful as she told a story about Ethan's childhood. But Sarah's attention was drawn to the window behind her. The dark glass reflected the room back at her, distorted by the low light. And there, just for a moment, a face pale, gaunt, and hollow-eyed seemed to stare back at her from the glass. Her breath hitched, her fork clattering against her plate as she froze in place. "Sarah, are you okay?" Ethan asked, his voice cutting through the fog of fear that had clouded her mind. Sarah blinked, her heart pounding in her chest. She looked again at the window, but the face was gone. It was just her reflection now, her own pale, terrified face staring back at her. Yeah, I'm fine," she whispered, but her voice shook, betraying her. She tried to smile, to play it off, but she could feel the tension in the room, the concerned gazes of Ethan's family fixed on her. "Are you sure?" Alice asked gently, her brows furrowed with worry. "You barely touched your food. I guess I'm just a little tired," Sarah said, offering what she hoped was a reassuring smile. "It's been a long day." Ethan placed a hand on her arm, his touch warm and grounding. "Why don't you go lay down for a bit?" he suggested softly. "You've had a long drive." For a moment, Sarah wanted to protest, to say that she was fine, that she didn't need to rest. But the truth was, she didn't think she could sit at that table any longer, not with the shadows pressing in from the windows, not with the weight of Jason's presence hanging over her like a shroud. "Maybe I will," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Ethan helped her up from the table, guiding her toward the guest room down the hall. The house was quiet, the walls lined with old family photos and knickknacks that spoke of years of memories. But as they passed the window at the end of the hallway, Sarah's breath caught in her throat. Through the glass, barely visible in the fading light, she saw a figure standing among the graves, a tall, shadowy figure with hollow eyes staring directly at her. Jason thought her legs trembled, her knees threatening to give out beneath her. She wanted to run, to scream, but her body was frozen in place, her mind unable to process what she was seeing. It couldn't be him. It just couldn't be. Ethan's voice pulled her back from the brink. "Sarah." She turned to him, her heart still racing, and forced a weak smile. "Sorry, I thought I saw something," she said, glancing back at the window. But the figure was gone, leaving only the dark silhouette of the cemetery behind. Ethan frowned, his brow creasing with concern. "Maybe you should rest for a bit," he said, gently guiding her into the guest room. Sarah nodded numbly, barely aware of her surroundings as Ethan helped her into bed. She lay down, pulling the blankets up around her shoulders, but her mind was still racing, her thoughts spinning wildly out of control. Jason was everywhere, in the shadows, in the reflections, in the spaces between her thoughts. Ethan leaned down and kissed her forehead, his touch warm and comforting. "Get some rest," he whispered. "I'll come check on you in a bit," Sarah nodded, closing her eyes, though sleep felt like an impossible thing. Her heart was still pounding in her chest, her skin still prickling with unease. As soon as Ethan left the room, The silence closed in around her like a vice. The only sound was the faint rustle of the trees outside, the wind whispering through the leaves. She kept her eyes closed, willing herself to calm down, to forget about Jason, to focus on the present, on Ethan, on the life they were building together. But as the minutes ticked by, she couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone. That somewhere just beyond the edge of the light, Jason was waiting. And then, from the corner of the room, came a soft, almost imperceptible sound, a whisper, low, quiet, and familiar. Sarah dot her eyes, snapped open, her breath catching in her throat. The room was empty, but the shadows seemed to crawl closer, reaching out from the corners, creeping toward her. And in the darkened window, she could see the faint outline of her face, Jason's face, staring at her with those hollow, dead eyes. Sarah dot, the whisper came again, louder this time, and Sarah felt a cold hand close around her heart. She wanted to scream, but the sound died in her throat. Jason was here. He had always been here. And now he was waiting for her to join him. Part 4. A night of terror. The night crept in slowly, like an unwelcome guest slipping into the corners of Ethan's childhood home. The warm glow of the lamps in the guest room did little to chase away the thick shadows that clung to the walls, stretching and shifting like something alive. Outside, the wind howled faintly, rattling the old windows as though it too wanted entry. Sarah lay in bed, staring up at the ceiling. Her mind churned, refusing her any semblance of peace. Every creak of the house, every whisper of the wind sent a fresh wave of tension through her, tightening her chest, quickening her pulse. Sleep felt impossible, and the dark silence pressed down on her like a suffocating weight. Ethan was beside her, already fast asleep. His steady breathing should have been comforting, but it did nothing to quell the rising sense of dread building inside her. She turned her head, watching him sleep, envying the ease with which he could surrender to unconsciousness. She wanted to shake him awake, to tell him about the face she had seen at dinner, the face she had seen at the window, watching her from the cemetery. But how could she explain what she couldn't even understand herself? Jason was gone. He had been gone for years. This was Ethan's world, Ethan's life, and she was supposed to be moving forward with him, not haunted by shadows of the past. Yet every time she closed her eyes, she saw Jason's ghostly face, his eyes hollow, his expression twisted with something dark, something that didn't belong to the boy she had once loved. The wind picked up outside, brushing against the old house with a low, mournful moan. Sarah's skin prickled with goosebumps. She pulled the blanket tighter around her, though it did little to warm the icy chill that had settled into her bones. And then she felt it, that unmistakable sensation. The sensation of being watched. Her heart leapt in her chest, and she sat up abruptly, her breath hitching in her throat. The room was still, bathed in a soft, golden glow from the bedside lamp, but that presence, it was there. She could feel it. Eyes, cold, unblinking eyes, watching. Her gaze darted toward the window. The thin, white curtain fluttered slightly, as though a breeze had passed through the room, but there was no breeze, none that could reach this deep inside the house. Sarah's stomach twisted into knots as the unease took root deep inside her. Slowly, her body rigid with fear, she swung her legs out from under the blanket and placed her bare feet on the cold wooden floor. She stood, her knees trembling, and took a tentative step toward the window. The shadows seemed to shift as she moved, pooling in the corners of the room, thickening like ink. The sensation of being watched grew stronger with each step, pressing down on her like invisible hands. She wanted to turn back, to crawl into bed and wake Ethan, but some inexplicable force pulled her forward. And then she heard it, a knock, soft, faint, insistent that her blood turned to ice. She froze, her heart hammering in her chest. The knock came again, louder this time, though still soft, as though whoever or whatever was on the other side was being careful, almost delicate. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she approached the window, her trembling hand reaching for the curtain. She didn't want to pull it back. She didn't want to see what was on the other side. But her body moved of its own accord, driven by a morbid curiosity that overpowered her fear. With a shaky exhale, she grasped the edge of the curtain and pulled it aside. Jason's face was pressed against the glass. Sarah's heart seized in her chest, and she let out a small, strangled gasp. Her knees nearly buckled beneath her. It couldn't be him. It couldn't. But there he was, just inches away, separated only by the thin barrier of the window. His face was pale, almost translucent, like the reflection of a corpse. His once warm, kind eyes were now hollow, dark bits of shadow that seemed to stretch endlessly into nothingness. His skin clung tightly to his bones, giving his features a gaunt, skeletal appearance. And his lips, those familiar lips that had once kissed her so gently, were moving silently, forming words she couldn't hear. He was beckoning her. Jason's hand slowly raised, his fingers tapping softly against the glass. "Come." His lips mouthed the word again and again, though no sound escaped him. Sarah's mind raced. Her body trembled violently, and she took a step back, shaking her head in disbelief. This wasn't real. It couldn't be. Jason was dead. He had to be. But the figure before her, the face she had loved so deeply, was unmistakable. And then, as if sensing her hesitation, Jason's expression twisted. His smile widened unnaturally, stretching across his face in a grotesque parody of the boy she had once known. His hand flattened against the glass, fingers played as though he was trying to push through to reach her. The tapping grew louder, more urgent. "Come with me," the silent words on his lips screamed. Sarah stumbled backward, her legs shaking so violently she could barely stand. She let out a small, panicked cry, her heart hammering in her chest as the room seemed to tilt, the walls closing in on her. She spun around, her breath coming in short, terrified gasps. She had to wake Ethan. He had to see this, he had to help her. She rushed to the bed, nearly tripping over her own feet in her desperation. "Ethan," she whispered, her voice choked with fear. She grabbed his arm, shaking him. "Ethan, wake up." Ethan groaned, blinking groggily as he sat up. "Sarah?" "What's wrong?" His voice was thick with sleep, his eyes unfocused. There's someone outside," Sarah stammered, her voice trembling. "It's Jason. He's at the window." Ethan frowned, his expression confused. "What? Jason?" "Sarah, that's not." "Please," he pleaded, her eyes wide with terror. "Just look, please." Ethan sighed, clearly thinking it was just another bad dream. But the fear in Sarah's voice was enough to convince him to check. He swung his legs out of bed, rubbing his eyes before heading toward the window. Sarah stayed behind him, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. Ethan reached for the curtain and pulled it back. The window was empty. There was nothing but the darkness of the night, the shadows of the trees swaying in the wind. No face. No Jason. Just an empty stretch of glass reflecting the inside of the room. "See," Ethan said gently, trying to soothe her. "There's no one here." Sarah shook her head, her pulse still racing. She was so sure she had seen him. Jason's face had been right there, staring at her through the glass, his hand pressed against the window. But now, there was nothing. Ethan took her hand, pulling her gently toward him. "It was just a dream," he said softly, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. "You've been under a lot of stress, and maybe your mind is playing tricks on you." "But I saw him," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. Her skin prickled with cold, and the airy image of Jason's face was burned into her mind. She couldn't shake it. "I saw him, Ethan. He was there, right outside." Ethan's eyes softened with concern. He pulled her closer, wrapping his arms around her. "It's okay," he murmured, kissing the top of her head. "It's okay. You're safe. I'm here." Sarah buried her face in his chest, trying to steady her breathing. But even as she clung to him, she couldn't shake the feeling that Jason was still out there, watching her. The room felt too quiet, the shadows too deep, and the memory of his twisted smile haunted her, lingering at the edges of her vision. Ethan led her back to bed, pulling the blanket over them as he held her close. "Try to sleep," he whispered. Everything would feel better in the morning, but Sarah knew that sleep wouldn't come. Not with the memory of Jason's face still fresh in her mind, not with the feeling of his presence pressing in around her. She lay stiffly beside Ethan, her eyes wide open, staring into the dark. Outside, the wind picked up again, brushing against the window with a soft, rhythmic tap. Tap, 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 tap. Sarah's breath hitched, her pulse racing. The tapping grew louder, more insistent. He was still there, Dot, and this time he wouldn't go away. Part 5. The Ghostly Encounter. The hours stretched long and cruel through the night, each minute dragging Sarah deeper into a void of terror and confusion. Sleep was a distant stranger, something she could not grasp. Every time her eyes fluttered shut, the image of Jason's gaunt, ghostly face was waiting for her, staring through the darkness, as if pulling her toward him, beckoning her with that twisted, silent smile. She lay in bed, her body rigid, her mind on high alert. The room was suffocatingly quiet, save for the soft sound of Ethan's steady breathing beside her. He had fallen back into sleep easily after reassuring her that there was no one outside, no Jason, no ghost. But Sarah knew better. She had seen him, Dot, and now, even with the window clear, the shadows outside creeping like ghosts through the trees, she felt him. Felt his presence clinging to the edges of the room, lurking just beyond the reach of the warm glow of the bedside lamp. He was near, watching, waiting. She shivered beneath the blankets, pulling them tighter around her body, as if they could somehow shield her from the cold, from the fear gnawing at her insides. But there was no escaping it. He was there, though. She could feel it in the air, thick and heavy like a storm about to break. Her mind replayed the moment again and again, Jason's face pressed against the glass, his pale, hollow eyes staring into her soul, his lips moving silently, forming words she couldn't hear but could feel deep within her bones. "Come with me," he had beckoned. The memory made her stomach churn, her skin crawl with dread. What did he want? Why was he here now, after all these years? The more she tried to make sense of it, the more the darkness pressed in, as though the very house itself was conspiring against her, trapping her in this nightmare. She turned her head slightly, glancing at Ethan. His face was peaceful, untroubled. She envied him that peace, that ability to close his eyes and drift off into oblivion, unaware of the terror that clung to every breath she took. But even in his sleep, his presence didn't make her feel safe. The thing haunting her wasn't something he could fight, something he could protect her from. Jason's ghost, if that's what it was something beyond the world Ethan understood, beyond his ability to help. And deep down, Sarah knew this was a battle she would have to face alone. The wind outside howled again, rattling the window slightly, as if mocking her, as if trying to remind her that the barrier between the world of the living and the dead was thinner than she thought. Jason had crossed that barrier, Dot. Somehow, someway he had found her again, and now there was no escaping him. Her heart pounded in her chest, her pulse thrumming in her ears like the ticking of some invisible clock counting down. She could almost hear the echo of his voice, soft and haunting, calling her name from the depths of the night. "Sarah." She jerked upright in bed, her eyes wide, her breath coming in short, ragged gasps. The room was still, the only sound the faint rustle of the trees outside. But she had heard it, she was certain. His voice, faint but unmistakable, calling her from the beyond. She stared at the window, half expecting to see his face there again, staring back at her. But the window remained dark, reflecting only the dim light of the room. Trembling, Sarah climbed out of bed. She moved slowly, as if afraid that any sudden movement might stir Jason from wherever he was lurking. The wooden floor was cold beneath her bare feet, sending a shiver up her spine. Her eyes never left the window, and each step toward it felt like a march toward the inevitable. She reached the glass and pressed her fingertips against it, the coldness biting into her skin. Her breath fogged the surface as she leaned closer, peering into the darkness beyond. For a moment, nothing. Only the inky blackness of the night, the skeletal trees swaying in the wind, and the distant, haunting silhouettes of the gravestones in the cemetery. But then, as if the shadows themselves shifted, she saw him again. Jason Dodd standing between the trees, just beyond the edge of the graveyard. His face was barely visible, shrouded in darkness, but his eyes, those empty, hollow eyes, were fixed on her, glowing faintly with an unnatural light. He didn't move. He didn't blink. He just watched. Sarah's breath hitched, and for a moment, the world seemed to fall away, leaving only her and the ghostly figure of the boy she had once loved. Time seemed to stretch, as though the night itself were frozen in place, trapping her in this moment of horror. She felt his presence as surely as if he was standing beside her, his cold breath brushing against her neck, his whispered voice curling around her like a fog. She wanted to scream, but the sound lodged in her throat, strangled by the fear that had wrapped itself around her like a noose. Her hand trembled against the glass, and without thinking she mouthed his name, Jason Dot. At the soundless utterance of his name, Jason's lips parted in a slow, ghastly smile. His eyes darkened further, 2 bits of endless night, and then his hand moved. He raised it slowly, deliberately, until his fingertips touched his lips. Then, just as deliberately, he pointed to her. His mouth formed words, and though Sarah couldn't hear them, she understood. Dot, her knees buckled, and she stumbled backward, away from the window, her heart racing so fast she thought it might explode. Jason didn't move. He remained there, his hand still raised, still beckoning her to join him. Tears burned in her eyes as she turned away from the window, her body shaking uncontrollably. She rushed to the bed, grabbing Ethan's arm and shaking him hard. "Ethan, wake up," she pleaded, her voice choked with panic. "Please, wake up," Ethan groaned, rubbing his eyes as he slowly woke. "Sarah, what's going on?" "He's there," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Jason, he's outside. I saw him. He's trying to reach me," Ethan sat up, concern etched across his face. "Sarah, you're scaring me. There's no one outside." "I'm not imagining it," she cried, her voice cracking. "He's there, Ethan. He's out there, and he's trying to get to me." Ethan's frown deepened as he climbed out of bed. "Okay," he said, his tone calm but serious. "I'll check. But I promise you, there's no one there." Sarah watched him walk to the window, her entire body trembling with fear. She knew what she had seen. She knew Jason was out there. Ethan wouldn't see him, he couldn't. Jason wasn't there for him. He was there for her. Ethan pulled back the curtain, his movements slow and deliberate, as if trying to reassure her. He peered out into the night, his eyes scanning the darkness. "See," he said softly, turning back to her with a small, forced smile. "There's no one here, Sarah. It's just the wind and the shadows playing tricks on you." Sarah shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "No," she whispered. "He's there, Ethan. I saw him." But Ethan was already crossing the room, pulling her into his arms. "Shay." "It's okay," he murmured, holding her tightly. "You're just tired. You've been under a lot of stress, and your mind is playing tricks on you. It's okay." Sarah wanted to believe him. She wanted to fall into his arms and let his warmth chase away the cold that had settled into her soul. But the image of Jason, standing in the cemetery, his hollow eyes fixed on her, wouldn't leave her mind. He was real, Dot. She knew he was. "I think you just need to rest," Ethan said, his voice gentle but firm. "It's been a long night, and you're exhausted." Sarah didn't respond. She couldn't. The fear had wrapped itself around her heart like a vice, squeezing tighter with each passing second. Ethan didn't understand. He couldn't. He hadn't seen Jason, hadn't felt the icy pull of the dead reaching out to claim her. But she had. Reluctantly, Sarah let Ethan guide her back to bed. She lay down beside him, but her body remained tense, her mind too alert, too consumed by fear to relax. Ethan stroked her hair gently, whispering soft reassurances, but none of it reached her. As the minutes ticked by, Sarah's eyes drifted once again to the window. The shadows outside seemed to shift and move, as though they were alive. And though Ethan had seen nothing, she knew. Jason was still there, Dot waiting, watching, and he wouldn't stop until he had her. Part 6. The Visit to the Grave. The dawn broke reluctantly over the landscape, a muted, pale light that barely pushed back the lingering shadows of night. The sky was painted in shades of grey and bruised violet, as if the sun itself had chosen to shy away from this place. The mist clung to the ground, swirling in soft tendrils through the trees. wrapping around the gravestones like a forgotten memory, refusing to let go. It was the kind of morning where the world seemed half awake, caught between the living and the dead. Sarah stood by the window, staring out into the cemetery. Her breath fogged the glass, her reflection a ghostly figure in the early morning gloom. She hadn't slept, not a single moment of rest, her mind filled with Jason's haunting image. His presence had been with her all night, lurking in every corner of her thoughts, his hollow eyes following her, even in the moment she dared to blink. She felt like she was suffocating, drowning in the weight of it all. Ethan stirred in bed behind her, his movements sluggish, the drowsiness of sleep still clinging to him. He groaned softly and stretched, blinking at the faint light creeping into the room. Sarah's voice was thick with sleep, but there was an edge of concern in it. He knew something was wrong. He had known since last night, since the terror in her eyes refused to fade. She didn't turn to face him. "I need to go to his grave," she whispered, her voice tight, as if speaking the words aloud might break her. Ethan sat up, the sheets rustling as he pushed them off. "Sarah," said, his tone soft but worried, "you don't have to do this. It's just going to upset you more." She turned then, her eyes wide and dark, brimming with an intensity that left no room for argument. "I need to see him, Ethan. I need to say goodbye." Ethan ran a hand through his hair, letting out a slow breath. He knew there was no point in trying to talk her out of it. The determination in her eyes was too fierce, too desperate. "Okay," he said, his voice resigned. "We'll go. But after this, Sarah, I need you to let it go. You have to find some way to let him rest and to let yourself move on." Sarah's throat tightened, and she nodded, though she wasn't sure if she could do what Ethan was asking. Jason wasn't resting, though he hadn't moved on, and he wasn't letting her move on either. He was still here, pulling her back to him, and she couldn't escape it. They dressed in silence, the weight of unspoken fears hanging heavily in the room. The walk to the cemetery was short, but the journey felt endless. Ethan led the way, his hand firm in hers, though Sarah's fingers barely responded to his warmth. She was cold, as though the chill of the grave had already touched her. The mist grew thicker as they approached the cemetery gates, curling around their ankles, making the world feel small and suffocating. The gravestones loomed ahead, rising out of the fog like silent sentinels guarding the secrets of the dead. The air was damp, heavy with the scent of wet earth and decaying leaves. Sarah's skin prickled as they crossed the threshold, her heartbeat quickening with every step. The cemetery was quiet, too quiet. The usual sounds of morning, the birds, the wind through the trees, seemed to have vanished, leaving only the eerie stillness of the dead. Sarah's breath came in shallow, uneven bursts as they made their way deeper into the graveyard, her eyes scanning the rows of gravestones, searching for the one that bore Jason's name. Ethan kept glancing at her, his brow furrowed with concern. "Are you sure about this?" he asked softly, his voice barely above a whisper, as though speaking too loudly would disturb the dead. "I'm sure," she replied, though the words felt hollow. Was she sure? Did she really want to see his grave, to face the reality of what had happened all those years ago? She didn't know, but something was pulling her forward, something stronger than fear or doubt. After what felt like an eternity, they found it. Jason's grave. The tombstone was smaller than Sarah had imagined it would be, worn and neglected, its edges chipped and weathered by time. Moss clung to the cracks, and the name etched into the stone was barely legible, half faded as though the earth itself was trying to erase him from memory. Jason Dawn. The name sent a jolt of pain through her chest, a sharp reminder of the boy she had once loved, the boy who had vanished without a trace, leaving behind nothing but questions and heartache. She dropped to her knees in front of the grave, her legs trembling, her breath hitching in her throat. Ethan stood beside her, his hand resting gently on her shoulder, but Sarah barely felt it. Her entire world had narrowed to the small, cold stone in front of her, and the ghost of the boy it marked. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice breaking as tears welled up in her eyes. "I'm so sorry." Her fingers trembled as they reached out, brushing against the rough surface of the tombstone. It was cold, so cold, as though the very essence of death had seeped into the stone. The coldness seemed to spread through her fingers, up her arms sinking into her chest. She shuddered, her teeth chattering as a sob escaped her lips. "I didn't mean to leave you," she choked out, her tears falling freely now. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen." She bowed her head, her forehead resting against the tombstone, her fingers gripping the edges of the stone, as though she could hold on to him, as though she could somehow pull him back from the grave, back into the world of the living. But all she felt was the cold, unyielding stone beneath her hands, a stark reminder that he was gone. Truly gone. Ethan knelt beside her, his arm wrapping around her shoulders, pulling her close. "Sarah," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "He's at peace now. You need to let him go." But Sarah shook her head, her sobs growing louder, her chest tight with grief. "He's not at peace, Ethan," she cried. "He's still here. He hasn't gone. He's still waiting for me." Ethan's brow furrowed in confusion, his grip tightening on her as he tried to pull her away from the grave. "Sarah, you're not making sense. Jason's gone. He's been gone for years." She lifted her head, her tear-streaked face twisted with anguish as she looked at him. "No, Ethan, he's not gone. I've seen him. I've felt him. He's still here, and he wants something. He wants me." Ethan stared at her, his eyes wide with disbelief. "Sarah, listen to yourself. You're grieving. You're confused. But Jason's dead. Whatever you think you've seen is not real. It's just your mind playing tricks on you." But Sarah pulled away from him, shaking her head violently. "No, you don't understand," she cried. "It's not in my head. He's here. I've seen him, Ethan. I've seen his face. He's been following me. He's been calling to me." Ethan's expression softened with concern, his hand reaching for hers. "Sarah, you're exhausted. This is the grief talking. You need to take a step back and know," she shouted, standing up suddenly, her hands clenched into fists. "You're not listening. He's here. Right here. Right now." The wind picked up then, swirling around them in a sudden, violent gust. The mist thickened, curling through the air like ghostly fingers. The leaves rustled in the trees, and the eerie silence that had hung over the cemetery was broken by the low, mournful howl of the wind. Sarah's heart raced as she turned back toward Jason's grave, her pulse pounding in her ears. The stone seemed to shimmer in the mist, the letters on his name fading in and out of focus. For a moment she thought she saw movement, just a flicker behind the gravestone. Her breath hitched, and she stepped closer, her eyes wide with fear. "Jason," she whispered, her voice trembling. The wind howled again, and the mist seemed to part for just a moment. And there, standing just behind the gravestone, was Jason. Sarah's blood turned to ice. He was just as she had seen him the night before, pale, gaunt, his hollow eyes dark and empty, his lips twisted into a silent, eerie smile. He stood there, motionless, his hands at his sides, watching her with an intensity that made her heart stop. Ethan's voice broke through the fog of her terror. "Sarah, what are you looking at?" But Sarah couldn't tear her eyes away from Jason. He was there, right in front of her. She could see him, feel his presence like a cold shadow wrapped around her soul. "Jason," she whispered again, her voice barely audible. Jason's smile widened, his eyes gleaming with something dark and unnatural. His lips moved, but no sound came out. Still, Sarah understood. He was waiting for her. He had always been waiting. "Sarah." Ethan's voice was closer now, his hand reaching for her arm. But she didn't move. She couldn't. Her entire being was focused on the ghostly figure of Jason, standing in the mist just out of reach. And then, slowly, deliberately, Jason lifted his hand, extending it toward her. The world around her seemed to fade, the mist thickening, swallowing the gravestones, the trees, even Ethan. All that remained was Jason, his hand outstretched, his eyes locked on hers. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest, her body frozen with fear. But there was something else too, something that pulled at her, something that made her want to take his hand, to join him in the mist. "Come with me." The words echoed in her mind, soft and insistent, as though he had whispered them directly into her soul. She took a step forward, her hand reaching out instinctively, her fingers trembling. Sarah Ethan's voice was sharp now, filled with panic. He grabbed her arm, pulling her back. The mist swirled violently, and Jason's figure flickered, then vanished, swallowed by the fog. Sarah gasped, her body shaking, her heart racing as Ethan held her close, his voice frantic. What the hell was that? What just happened? But Sarah couldn't answer. She stared at the spot where Jason had stood, her mind reeling, her heart heavy with the weight of what she had just seen. Jason was gone. But he wasn't finished with her. Not yet. Part 7. The cold hand. The cemetery lay silent, the morning mist clinging to the ground like a shroud as Sarah and Ethan stood frozen by Jason's grave. The world around them seemed to be holding its breath, the air thick with something unnatural, something that made Sarah's skin prickle with unease. She had felt it ever since they had entered the graveyard, and now as she stood before Jason's tombstone stone, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly, horribly wrong. The mist swirled lazily around them, but the cold that seeped into Sarah's bones was not from the damp air. It was something deeper, something more chilling, as if the very ground beneath her feet had turned to ice. Her fingers brushed against the cold, worn surface of the tombstone, and she flinched at the sensation, a coldness that seemed to pull the warmth from her body, leaving her hollow and trembling. Ethan's hand tightened on her shoulder, a small gesture of comfort, but it did little to calm the storm that was brewing inside her. She had seen Jason, felt him. His ghostly figure standing just beyond the gravestone, his hollow eyes fixed on hers. And though Ethan hadn't seen him, Sarah knew he was still there, watching her from the shadows, waiting for her to fall into his grasp. Her mind raced with thoughts, her heartbeat thundering in her ears. The world around her felt wrong off kilter, like a dream teetering on the edge of a nightmare. She was here, in the real world, standing next to Ethan, but she also felt as though she was standing somewhere else, somewhere darker. A place where Jason still lingered, a place he wanted her to join. Ethan's voice broke through her spiraling thoughts. "Sarah, are you okay?" he asked softly, his brow furrowed with concern. He had asked her the same question at least a dozen times since they had arrived at the cemetery, but each time his voice grew more worried, more desperate, for an answer she couldn't give him. "I don't know," Sarah whispered, her breath fogging in the cold morning air. She didn't know if she was okay. She didn't know if she was losing her mind. All she knew was that Jason was still with her, haunting her every step. Ethan took a step closer, pulling her into his arms, but even his warmth couldn't reach the coldness that gripped her heart. "Let's go," he said, his voice firm but gentle. "There's nothing here, Sarah. This isn't helping you. We need to leave." Sarah nodded numbly, but as she turned away from the grave, something stopped her. A chill shot down her spine, so cold, so sudden that it felt like ice water had been poured down her back. Her breath caught in her throat, and for a moment the world around her seemed to freeze. And then she felt it. A hand brought a cold, deathly hand resting on her shoulder, its icy fingers curling into her skin. The touch was impossibly cold, colder than anything she had ever felt. It wasn't Ethan's hand. It couldn't be. His touch was warm, alive. This was something else, something from beyond the grave. Her body went rigid, her heart pounding so loudly she thought it might explode. She couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The coldness spread through her body, turning her blood to ice, numbing her limbs, paralyzing her with terror. And then came the whisper. Sarah thought Jason's voice soft, familiar, but warped by something dark and sinister. It sent a shock of fear through her, freezing her in place. His breath was cold against her ear, so close she could feel it brushing against her skin. She wanted to scream, to tear herself away from the icy grip, but she couldn't move. She was trapped, caught in a web of fear and disbelief. "Sarah," the voice whispered again, more insistent this time, as if he were right behind her, leaning in, his lips inches from her ear. "Come with me." The words twisted around her, wrapping her in a suffocating sense of dread. Her vision blurred, the world around her spinning as the cold hand tightened its grip on her shoulder. She could feel him, Jason, his presence wrapping around her like a noose, pulling her deeper into the nightmare she couldn't escape. Her breath came in short, Panic gasped as the reality of what was happening hit her with full force. Jason was here, Dot. He wasn't just a figment of her imagination, some shadow from the past. He was real, and he was trying to take her with him. With a strangled cry, Sarah jerked away from the cold hand, stumbling backward, her heart racing wildly in her chest. She spun around, her eyes wide with terror, expecting to see Jason standing there, his hollow eyes staring back at her. But there was nothing, no one. Only the gravestones shrouded in mist, and Ethan standing a few feet away, his face pale with confusion and concern. Sarah Ethan rushed toward her, his hands reaching out to steady her as she swayed on her feet. What happened? What's wrong? Sarah's body shook uncontrollably, her skin still tingling from the icy touch. She looked up at Ethan, her breath coming in ragged gasps. He touched me, she stammered, her voice trembling with fear. Jason. He touched me. I heard him. Ethan's eyes widened, his face pale. Sarah, there's no one here, he said gently, though his voice was laced with worry. You're just... I'm not imagining it, Sarah snapped, her voice rising in panic. I felt him. I heard him. He was right here. Ethan stared at her, his eyes filled with concern, but he didn't believe her. She could see it in his face. He thought she was losing her mind, that the stress of everything had finally pushed her over the edge. But Sarah knew what she had felt. She knew Jason was there, lurking just out of sight, waiting for the right moment to pull her into his world. Her hand shook as she ran them through her hair, trying to steady herself, but the coldness wouldn't leave her. It clung to her skin, seeping into her bones, a constant reminder that Jason was still near. Ethan took a step closer, his hand resting gently on her arm. Sarah, listen to me, he said softly, his voice soothing. You're just exhausted. All of this is in your head. Jason is gone. He's been gone for years. You have to let him go. No, Sarah whispered, shaking her head. He's not gone. He's here. He's always been here. Ethan's face tightened with frustration, but he kept his voice calm. Sarah, I know this is hard for you, but you're not thinking clearly. We need to go back to the house, okay? We'll figure this out, but right now you need to rest. Sarah's chest heaved with shallow breaths as she stared at him, the coldness inside her growing with each passing second. How could he not feel it? How could he not see what was happening? Jason was here, right here, and Ethan was acting as though everything was normal. I'm not crazy, Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. I know what I felt. I know you're not, Ethan said gently, pulling her into his arms. But you're scared, and your mind is playing tricks on you. Let's just get out of here, okay? Sarah didn't respond. She couldn't. Her mind was racing, her thoughts tangled in fear and confusion. How could she make him understand? How could she explain the icy hand on her shoulder, the voice in her ear, when no one else could feel it? As Ethan led her away from Jason's grave, Sarah glanced over her shoulder, her heart pounding in her chest. The mist swirled around the gravestones, hiding them from view, but she could feel Jason watching her. The cold hand was gone, but the chill remained, lingering in the air, wrapping itself around her like a ghostly presence. And in the silence that followed, she could still hear his voice, soft and insistent, whispering her name. Sarah thought the sound sent a shiver down her spine, and as she and Ethan left the cemetery, she couldn't shake the feeling that Jason wasn't done with her yet. He was waiting, and he wouldn't stop until she was his. Part 8. Confronting the Past. The air was suffocating as Sarah walked away from the cemetery, her mind a whirlwind of fear, confusion, and overwhelming sorrow. The sky above was a dull, oppressive grey, matching the heaviness that clung to her chest like iron chains. Every step felt labored, as though something unseen was holding her back, pulling her toward the place she wanted so desperately to escape. Jason. His name echoed in her mind like a haunting melody, looping endlessly, wrapping around her thoughts, tightening its grip with each passing second. She couldn't shake the feeling that he was still there, watching her, his presence lingering just beyond the edge of her awareness. The coldness she had felt when his hand touched her shoulder still clung to her skin, a ghostly reminder that he hadn't gone. He wasn't gone, thought Sarah. Ethan's voice broke through the fog in her mind, pulling her back to the present. He was walking beside her, his hand gripping hers firmly, his eyes filled with concern. He had been talking for several minutes, trying to reassure her, but his words barely registered. Everything around her felt distant, muffled, as though she were watching the world from the other side of her veil. "Are you okay?" he asked again, his brow furrowing as he glanced down at her. Sarah nodded automatically, though she wasn't okay. How could she be? She had just seen the ghost of her first love, felt his cold, dead hand on her shoulder, heard his voice whispering her name. Her chest tightened, her breath coming in shallow gasps as the reality of the situation crashed over her in waves. Jason wasn't at rest, he hadn't moved on. And now, after all these years, he was reaching out from beyond the grave, pulling her back toward him, refusing to let her go. The thought made her stomach churn with dread. They reached the edge of the cemetery, and Ethan gently tugged her to a stop, his hand still wrapped around hers. "Sarah, please," he said, his voice soft but urgent. "Talk to me." "What's going on?" She looked up at him, her eyes wide, her heart pounding in her chest. How could she explain what she was feeling? How could she make him understand that Jason's ghost wasn't just a figment of her imagination? That he was real, and he wanted her back? "I don't know," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I don't know what's happening." Ethan's grip on her hand tightened. "We need to go back to the house," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "You're exhausted, you've been through a lot, and your mind is just no." Sarah interrupted, her voice suddenly sharp. She pulled her hand from his, taking a step back, her pulse racing. "This isn't in my head, Ethan. Jason is real. He's still here." Ethan's face paled, and his eyes softened with worry. "Sarah, Jason is gone. He's been gone for years." "You need to stop saying that," Sarah snapped, her voice rising with panic. "You didn't feel him. You didn't hear him. I did. He touched me, Ethan. I felt his hand on my shoulder, and I heard him whispering my name." Her hand shook as she spoke, her chest tightening with fear and frustration. Why couldn't he understand? Why couldn't he see that Jason was haunting her, that his ghost was trying to pull her back to him? Ethan's brow furrowed, his expression torn between confusion and concern. "Sarah, I believe that you believe this," he said slowly, carefully, as though he were choosing his words with great care. "But I think your mind is playing tricks on you. You've been through a traumatic experience and..." "Traumatic?" Sarah let out a bitter laugh, her heart pounding in her chest. "You have no idea what I've been through, Ethan. You don't understand what it's like to feel someone's presence when you know they shouldn't be there. You don't understand what it's like to see a ghost." Ethan's face tightened, his jaw clenching slightly. "Sarah," he said, his voice steady but firm, "I do understand. I've lost people too. But what you're seeing is not real, it's grief. It's your mind playing tricks on you." Sarah shook her head, her throat tightening with frustration. "No, Ethan. This isn't grief. This is real." "Jason is real." Ethan let out a long, slow breath, rubbing his hand over his face. "Okay," he said softly, his voice resigned. "Okay, what do you think Jason wants?" The question hit Sarah like a punch to the gut, stealing the breath from her lungs. What did Jason want? She had been avoiding the answer ever since she first saw him, ever since his ghostly presence had appeared in the shadows, haunting her thoughts, invading her dreams. She knew the answer, but saying it out loud made it feel too real, too terrifying. "He wants me," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "He wants to take me back." Ethan's eyes widened in disbelief, but before he could respond, Sarah continued, her words tumbling out in a rush. "I don't know why, I don't know how, but he's not at rest, Ethan. He's been waiting for me. All these years he's been waiting." Ethan's face softened with sadness, and he reached for her hand again. "Sarah, you don't have to do this. You don't have to carry this guilt. Whatever happened with Jason is in the past. It's over." But Sarah shook her head, tears welling up in her eyes. "It's not over. It will never be over. Not until I figure out why he's still here. Not until I figure out what he wants." The wind picked up then, swirling around them, tugging at Sarah's hair and sending a chill down her spine. She shivered, wrapping her arms around herself as the coldness settled in, sinking deep into her bones. She had loved Jason once. loved him more deeply than she had ever thought possible. He had been her first love, her everything. And when he had disappeared, it had shattered her. She had spent years trying to move on, trying to forget him, but he had never really left her. He had always been there, in the back of her mind, a shadow of what could have been. And now he was back. His ghost, his spirit, whatever he was reaching out to her, pulling her back into the past, refusing to let her go. Sarah's heart ached with the weight of it all. She had tried so hard to move on, to build a new life with Ethan. But now, standing here in the shadow of Jason's grave, she realized that she had never truly let go of him. She had never stopped loving him. And maybe that was why he had come back. "Jason," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion, "why are you doing this?" Ethan's hand on her arm tightened slightly, grounding her, pulling her back to the present. "Sarah," he said softly, "Jason is gone. You can't keep holding on to him, I know," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "But I don't know how to let him go." For a long moment, they stood in silence, the weight of Sarah's confession hanging heavily in the air. The wind howled around them, tugging at their clothes, but neither of them moved. Finally, Ethan spoke, his voice gentle but firm. "You have to try, Sarah. You have to let go for your sake. You can't keep living in the past. You can't let Jason's ghost haunt you forever." Sarah's chest tightened, her breath coming in short, shaky bursts. "I don't want him to haunt me," she whispered. "But I don't think I have a choice." Ethan's expression softened with sympathy, and he pulled her into his arms, holding her close. "You do have a choice," he murmured against her hair. "You always have a choice." But did she? As she clung to Ethan, her tears soaking into his shirt, Sarah wasn't sure anymore. She had always believed that she could control her life, that she could make her own decisions. But now, with Jason's ghost haunting her, pulling her back into the past, she felt like she was losing control, like the choices weren't hers to make anymore. Jason had come back for her. He had been waiting for her all this time. And now, after all these years, he wasn't going to let her go. The thought sent a shiver down her spine, and she pulled away from Ethan, wiping her tears with the back of her hand. "We need to go," she said softly, her voice trembling. "I can't stay here," Ethan nodded, his face pale and tense. "Okay," he said, his voice quiet. "Let's go." As they walked away from the cemetery, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that Jason was watching them, his presence lingering in the air, cold and heavy. She glanced over her shoulder, half expecting to see his ghostly figure standing among the gravestones, his eyes fixed on hers. But there was nothing, only the swirling mist and the silent gravestones. Still, the coldness remained, seeping into her skin, wrapping around her like a dark, suffocating cloud. She couldn't escape it. She couldn't escape him. And deep down, Sarah knew that Jason wouldn't stop until he had her, until she was his again, forever. Part 9. The Final Revelation. The morning sun struggled to break through the heavy mist that clung to the air, its pale light casting a faint glow over the landscape. The world around Sarah seemed trapped in twilight, a place where night and day bled together, where the boundaries between the living and the dead had been blurred beyond recognition. Her breath came in ragged gasps, each exhale clouding the air in front of her as her terror continued to mount. The cold grip of fear had taken hold of her heart, and it refused to let go. The cemetery was behind them now, but Sarah could still feel Jason's presence, like a shadow stretching out over her soul. It was as if he had followed them, his ghostly figure lurking just beyond her field of vision, waiting for the moment to pull her back into the darkness. She had felt him, heard him, and now she could almost sense him, his icy fingers reaching out, brushing against her skin like a cold breeze that sent shivers down her spine. Ethan walked beside her, his hand still holding hers, but his warmth felt distant now, as though he couldn't reach her through the fog of dread that wrapped around her. His words of comfort, his attempts to reassure her, had faded into the background, drowned out by the growing weight of her fear. She wasn't alone, not really. Jason was still with her, his ghostly presence lingering in the air, pulling her closer with each step. Sarah's heart raced as she glanced over her shoulder, her eyes scanning the mist for any sign of him. But the world around her was empty, just the dull grey of the fog and the faint outline of the trees in the distance. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that he was there, watching her, waiting for her to let her guard down. He was always waiting. Ethan turned to her, his face tight with concern. "Sarah, we're almost home," he said softly, his voice steady but tinged with worry. "You'll feel better once we're back. We can talk about everything, and I promise we'll figure it out." Sarah didn't respond. Her mind was too clouded, her thoughts too tangled in the memory of Jason's touch, his voice whispering in her ear. The coldness she had felt in the cemetery had followed her, clinging to her like a second skin, a constant reminder that Jason wasn't gone. He had never left, and now she was certain he never would. They reached Ethan's family home, the old wooden house looming in the distance, its dark silhouette barely visible through the mist. Normally, the sight of it would have brought Sarah some semblance of comfort and anchor to reality. But today it felt like a prison, a place where the shadows could close in on her, where Jason could trap her forever. As they stepped onto the porch, Sarah paused, her body going rigid as the familiar coldness crept up her spine. The air around her grew heavier, colder, as if the wall itself had taken a breath and was waiting for something to happen. And then she heard it, Sarah Dot. His voice, soft and insistent, echoed in her mind, as clear as if he was standing right next to her. The sound sent a shockwave of terror through her, her breath catching in her throat as her heart pounded wildly in her chest. She stumbled backward, her eyes wide with fear as she turned in every direction, searching for him. But there was no one there. "Sarah, what is it?" Ethan's voice was laced with alarm as he reached for her, but she pulled away, her body trembling with fear. "What are you hearing?" "What's wrong?" She shook her head, her hands flying up to cover her ears, as if that could block out the sound of Jason's voice. "He's here," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "He's still here," Ethan's face bowed, his eyes searching hers for some explanation, but Sarah didn't have the words to explain what she was feeling. All she knew was that Jason wasn't gone, that he was still haunting her, still calling out to her, still trying to drag her back to him. "Sarah, there's no one here," Ethan said gently, but his voice wavered with uncertainty. "Please, just come inside, we'll figure this out. I'll help you." But Sarah couldn't move. She couldn't tear herself away from the overwhelming presence that seemed to wrap around her, pulling her deeper into the abyss of her own fear. Jason's voice echoed in her mind, growing louder, more insistent, until it drowned out everything else. "I'm still here." Sarah thought the words sent a chill through her body, her knees buckling as the full weight of her terror crashed down on her. She fell to the ground, her hands gripping the dirt, as if it could somehow keep her tethered to reality, keep her from slipping away into the darkness that Jason was pulling her toward. Sarah Ethan was at her side in an instant, his hands on her shoulders, his voice frantic. "Sarah, please, look at me. You're safe, you're with me, no one is here, you're just..." But Ethan's words were swallowed by the mist, drowned out by the sound of Jason's voice, by the coldness that had seeped into Sarah's bones. Her vision blurred, the world around her spinning as the ground seemed to shift beneath her feet. The weight of Jason's presence pressed down on her, suffocating her, pulling her deeper into the darkness. "I'm still here," the words echoed in her mind, louder now, more urgent, as though Jason was standing right next to her, whispering in her ear. Sarah's heart raced, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps as she struggled to fight against the cold grip that was tightening around her. "Jason," she screamed, her voice raw with desperation. "Leave me alone." But her scream was swallowed by the mist, disappearing into the air, as though the world had chosen to ignore her cries for help. There was no one to hear her, no one to save her from the icy grip that was pulling her under. And then she felt it, his hand. The cold, ghostly grip tightened around her shoulder, freezing her in place, paralyzing her with fear. His touch was deathly cold, colder than anything she had ever felt, colder than the grave. It was the same touch she had felt in the cemetery, the same touch that had sent her spiraling into terror. But this time it was stronger, more real. Sarah's breath caught in her throat, her body trembling as she tried to pull away, but the cold hand held her firmly in place, refusing to let her go. Her heart raced, her pulse pounding in her ears as Jason's voice whispered in her mind, soft but unrelenting. "I'm still here, Sarah. I've always been here. And I always will be." Her vision blurred, the world around her fading into darkness as Jason's presence consumed her, dragging her back into the past, back into the shadow of her first love. The weight of his ghost pressed down on her, suffocating her, pulling her deeper into the abyss. Ethan's voice reached her through the haze, but it was faint, distant, as though he were miles away. She could feel his hands on her shoulders, warm and steady, but the coldness of Jason's grip drowned out everything else. She was trapped, caught between the world of the living and the dead, with Jason pulling her deeper into his realm, his voice a constant reminder that he would never let her go. "Sarah, please." Ethan's voice cracked with desperation. "You're stronger than this. You can fight it. I'm here. I'm real." But Sarah wasn't sure what was real anymore. The line between the living and the dead had blurred, and Jason's presence was so strong, so overwhelming, that it felt like the world around her had ceased to exist. The coldness intensified, spreading through her body like ice, numbing her limbs, freezing her in place. She could feel Jason's grip tightening, pulling her closer to him, pulling her back into the past where he had been waiting for her all these years. And in that moment, Sarah realized the truth. Jason wasn't going to leave her. He couldn't. He was a part of her now, a shadow that would follow her for the rest of her life, haunting her every step, every breath. She had loved him once, and that love had bound him to her, tethered him to the world of the living, even after death. There was no escaping him. With a final, shuddering breath, Sarah closed her eyes, her body trembling as Jason's cold hand tightened around her. His voice, soft and insistent, echoed in her mind, wrapping around her like a shroud. "I'm still here." The words were the last thing she heard before the darkness swallowed her whole, pulling her into the abyss where Jason waited. And as the mist thickened around them, as the coldness seeped into her very soul, Sarah knew that Jason would never let her go. He was hers, and she was his, forever.